Good afternoon, students. We're going to be looking at the whole topic of dystopian literature today, and I'm going to try and fit this into the text, The Handmaid's Tale, as much as possible. I've begun with Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd, which I think is a song about conformism and about the dangers of placing people into boxes, which a lot of dystopian literature is going to be about. The whole idea of utopia and dystopia are closely linked, hence the graphic. Okay, as you can see, there are a lot of similarities. The actual origins of utopia themselves, as I'll show you in a moment, were in satire. And it's often the case that one person's dystopia is another person's utopia. For instance, consider, say, a country like Iran for a moment, which, if you were a strict Shia Muslim, might be seen as a kind of utopia. But to those who don't belong to that kind of creed, it would not be seen in that way at all. And you could apply that to many different societies. Many of us will look at a particular society and see utopian elements to it. Others will see them as dystopian, as absolutely terrible. So the two, I think, there's a dialectic between the two all of the time. What is utopia? Well, actually, the person who came up with it was Thomas More, who was an Elizabethan scholar and a Catholic theologian. He was tutor and friend to Henry VIII. And when he coined the term utopia, he actually wrote a book, Utopia, and many people saw it as his idea of an ideal place. I don't think that that's actually true, though, because he carefully chose the word utopia, which in Greek means nowhere. And maybe Thomas More was telling us that when human beings try and create some kind of idea of perfection, it's illusionary, it's fantastical. And many dystopias come out of utopias. How can this be? Well, again, if we think of a society that tries to eliminate all opposition, a society which wants to present itself as perfect, very frequently those societies quickly become very coercive. And so that's an element of the dystopian genre that we're going to see, that actually idealistic or very morally pure people frequently give us dystopias. So some of the things that I'm going to be looking at is the idea that the dystopia is a kind of futuristic, imagined universe. Very, very often there is an element of oppressive control, and that's certainly going to be the case in The Handmaid's Tale, isn't it? Okay. I think it's this notion that a perfect society has to be maintained through force. And so some of the things that we're going to look at today, different types of utopia, would be a corporate utopia, a bureaucratic dystopia, a technological dystopia, a moral dystopia, or one that is predicated on totalitarian control. And dystopian literature can take from many different places. It can take from history, it can take from contemporary politics, and it often takes lots of elements from science. And some of you here were taught by me when we studied Frankenstein. We could actually see Frankenstein as one of the originating, emerging texts of dystopia, where science, in an attempt to use science to liberate mankind, Frankenstein actually ends up oppressing himself, other people, and creating a kind of dystopian environment. So what are the characteristics of dystopia? Well, as I said to you before, it's a very wide genre, so it's a bit like Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances. You may not have all the same eyes or all the same mouth, etc., but there are certain common features that characterize a family. And this is the case with the genre of dystopian literature. Frequently, we have propaganda being used to control citizens. That's certainly the case in The Handmaid's Tale, isn't it? Information and independent thought are completely restricted. So very often there's an element of tight media control. There's an element of being suspicious of literature and the arts. There's usually a figurehead, as we'll see in, say, a text like 1984. In The Handmaid's Tale, interestingly, we do not have a figurehead. It's more of what we could call an oligarchy than a kind of figurehead dictatorship. Citizens, as we know, are under constant surveillance, certainly the case in The Handmaid's Tale, where the angels and the eyes are the muscle and the surveillance elements of the state. And citizens live in a kind of highly dehumanized state. Violence is often very common. There's often a threat of torture or being informed upon, etc., etc. Very often, the natural world has been banished and distrusted, and so you can actually fit dystopian in and with the environment as well, and environmental fears. I think a lot of more 21st century dystopian works have an element of environmental catastrophe in them, yeah? Citizens, what's very characteristic to the genre is that citizens are required to conform to certain uniform expectations. This notion of the death of the individual, the idea of the liberty of the individual, the idea of having an internal private life is abolished. And that often fits in with ideas of surveillance and the use of technology to control human beings, to watch them and to categorize them, yeah? Individuality and dissent are always bad. And in 1984, the state, for instance, actively seeks those individuals who are not conforming and destroys them or coerces them into rejoining the state. Society is an illusion of a perfect utopian world. So often in dystopia, individuals in dystopia have to pretend that they live in a utopia. So the corporate control, good film, The Running Man. I actually used to have video clips in this presentation, but they're not working today, so unfortunately you can't watch them, okay? But in The Running Man, this is an idea, once again, of a large corporation controlling society. Another great example of this is Blade Runner, where the Tyrell Corporation control robots and are actually able to erase the boundary between humanity and technology. So often we have this idea of creeping corporate control. And in particular, I think in 21st century United States, with Donald Trump in power, I think this would be one of the more fruitful parts of dystopian genre. We have bureaucratic control, okay, where society is controlled by a kind of a mindless bureaucracy, a tangle of red tape, etc. And two examples that come to mind, I think, would be Kafka, in particular the work, the Trial and The Castle, where people are tried and people are controlled by faceless human beings who simply follow rules and regulations that nobody understands. Another example of that would be Gormenghast and Titus Groan, written by Mervyn Peake, which is about a kind of medieval world in which people follow rituals and they no longer know where those rituals came from. But if you try to oppose them, you're instantly killed. So this idea of bureaucracy, etc. Technological control is very prevalent at the moment, isn't it? And in particular, this kind of motif of a robotic world rebelling against human beings. iRobot springs to mind, Battlestar Galactica, some of you may have seen that. Again, where artificial intelligence is oppressed and where they begin to rebel against us. I put down here The Matrix as well, although The Matrix is slightly different, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, okay? Then we have this idea of a kind of philosophical or a religious control, okay, where society is controlled by a particular group of people. And this, of course, is where The Handmaid's Tale fits in. The Handmaid's Tale, as you will see when we start studying it in more detail, is a kind of composite work in which he looked at many different types of societies. Margaret Atwood is not only criticizing one type of society, many societies. She actually says in The Handmaid's Tale that she made up nothing, that every single practice in The Handmaid's Tale is practiced somewhere. So elements of The Handmaid's Tale came from, say, the Salem witch trials, we can see that. But there are also elements of Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran, for instance, and we'll be looking at those in more detail as well. I'm hoping you all recognize this young lady over here, and this seems to me to be another form of dystopian literature. In this particular branch, you have a state that controls you for the sake of games and hunting. And obviously in this case we've got the Hunger Games here. I've also put down the Matrix. Hunger Games is slightly different, of course, because in this particular country you have an almost gladiatorial system in which violence and blood and primitiveness is part of the dystopia, where the state is not all clean and technological in order to satisfy the baser, more bloodthirsty elements of society. They allow these kind of incredibly vicious games. I've spoken a bit about environmental ruin. I strongly recommend that you either read or watch The Road, by Cormac McCarthy, which is an absolutely superb dystopian novel. The film is very well made, and it actually captures the mise-en-scène of total destruction in a kind of post-nuclear winter world in which everything is ruined, etc. And what's quite interesting about this is, I'll say one little thing quickly about Freud. Some of you will remember that Sigmund Freud felt that there was a death wish in humanity, and that in many ways, although we like civilization, we actually rebelled against it. And disaster films are a huge genre within the dystopian genre, subgenre of it. And now, genetic mutations. Genetic mutations are going to enter the Handmaid's Tale, but they don't enter quite as often as they do in other Margaret Atwood novels. This is perhaps because her brother is a genetic engineer. And I strongly recommend, again, if you want to do really well in this course, you maybe look at Oryx and Crake, which is a superb novel by Margaret Atwood that deals directly with genetic mutation. Of course, in The Handmaid's Tale, we do have genetic mutations in the sense that children who have a mutation are called shredders, and they're immediately killed. They're shredded like you would paper. Tells you a great deal about The Handmaid's Tale, that disabled people would be treated in this particular way. Now, there seems to be a lot of elements of Nazism in The Handmaid's Tale, the way in which ethnic minorities are dealt with, homosexuals, and also genetic mutation. I told you a bit about Oryx and Crake, and why Oryx and Crake is so amazing and so interesting is that it's narrated from the point of view of someone called the Snowman. We don't really find out too much about him. What you do find out is that you are living in this kind of post-genetic experimentation world in which you get dangerous, horrible hybrid creatures, etc. So this very much fits into the whole idea that science is out of control. It's a Frankenstein motif, that science has been turned and used to dark ends. And I think it fits in quite closely with the idea of excessive corporate control. So the questions I thought we'd think about today are, why would an author choose to write a novel about a futuristic society with serious and sometimes dangerous faults? What current trends or ideas exist in our world today that the author might be thinking of? And what benefits do dystopian stories lend to you and your world? So I'm going to come back to those in a minute, because I think those are very important questions as we study The Handmaid's Tale. And what I've done here is I've put a whole series of articles, if you're interested, that you can read and look at that will give you further ideas about dystopian literature. I'm now going to stop the video at this particular point here